Anyway, first of all, thanks very much for that. I really need to start with two apologies. First, that I'm not Richard Ansell. And I'm not talking about the Grand Tour, and I'm very sorry about the last minute change and whether or not that has mucked up plans and expectations. I also need to apologize that I'm not Bob Shoemaker. Bob Shoemaker took the theme of the Grand Tour literally to heart and is currently on holiday in Venice. But this is very much a joint project. It's a joint, it's part of a series of bigger projects. And in the first instance, it came out of, how can I put it? You know, all websites after about 4 years look tired. After 10 years, they don't look just tired, they look old and decrepit. After 20 years, they look pathetic. And having been building a bunch of websites over the last 20 years, it has now come to the point where if we didn't do something to revive and revivify them, they would begin to fall over and die in the way that old historians tend to. So what we've been doing, Bob and I have been doing for the last year and a half with generous funding from the University of Sheffield alumni, is taking the Old Bailey for one, but also locating London's Path, which is the site I'm building on today, and also London Lives, and revamping those so that they're suitable for a Gen Z audience, as we like to think, in as much as they can be used on a phone first and are just a lot slicker and easier to use than they were. Now, with all those apologies, this paper draws on the recent update of the Locating London Lives website to ask a really simple question. What forces contributed to patterns of criminal prosecution? Do they reflect the prevalence of crime and the impact of economic and social forces? Or are these patterns simple legacies of changes in the systems of policing and criminal justice, access to justice in particular? And it uses a digital mapping methodology in association with trials heard at the Old Bailey to explore the distribution, the geographical distribution of felony prosecutions, testing the impact of changes in the night watch, in access to justice through the creation of magisterial rotation offices, and the rise of what we describe as proactive policing. And in the end, we argue that independent of any change in underlying criminal activity, the creation of new institutions of policing led to higher rates of felony prosecutions in Britain's most important criminal court. Of course, I hesitate to start the next paragraph because it refers to the historiography of crime and criminal justice over the last 50 years, and at least several contributors to that are in the room and online. But that historiography has been overwhelming and substantial and transformative of how we understand the period and arguably how we understand the state. Starting as an attempt to create a history from below, the records of criminal justice have been used to interrogate the experience and behavior of working people, social crime, and the socioeconomic causes of property crime in particular, including high food prices and the demobilization of soldiers and sailors, all provided the initial grist to that particular mill. But detailed analysis of the prosecutions made it clear that what court records document is in large measure the history of prosecution. We simply cannot know how many felonies actually occurred, especially in a historical context where the very notion of what a crime is profoundly contested. And as a result, the focus of historical research shifted from the economic and social drivers of criminal activity, whatever that is, to the institutional arrangements that resulted in prosecution and punishment. Studies of justice of the peace, policing, the pre-trial process, the criminal trial, and the punishment of people once convicted have identified several major institutional changes which prefigured the development of the modern criminal justice system. And what I want to do this evening is attempt to contribute to that literature. But before doing so, before attempting to do so, I should say something about the sources, because they are, in many ways, profoundly problematic. The team that created the Old Bailey proceedings online, including Mary Clayton and Louise Falcini, who will come to the seminar regularly, try to identify crime locations in every trial where they were recorded. But this information was neither universally nor consistently set down. It's detailed in approximately half of all cases, 32,000, of which just under 17,000 can be mapped. So essentially our sample, and it's a subset rather than a sample. And this is particularly with Penny Corfield in mind, because otherwise she will attack me for having implied that I was doing a proper social science sampling, when in fact I'm not.
You've anticipated my question.
Yes, no. I've been sure that you aren't allowed to ask it, which was the intent. Okay, but this subset of prosecution, 17,000 or so, is problematic in a number of ways. First, it incorporates biases derived from the character of the original reporting. Short trial accounts, for example, of petty crime, tended not to record locations. Second, many place names remain unmappable. Places like King Street and Stable Yard, for instance, could refer to a number of different locations, and there is no way without profound hard work to differentiate between all of them. And the markup process was also subject to a small but unknown level of error and omission. But as data sets go, 17,000 crime locations strike me as a reasonably good size at the very least. It may not be big data, but it's bigger data than you usually get for most 18th century things. And to these statistics, we then added figures for population density and change over time, allowing the calculation of per capita prosecution rates. But like the prosecution statistics themselves, in the era before the 1801 census, these are necessarily estimates. For data for individual parishes, we've used the number of deaths recorded in the bills of mortality, which are then multiplied to reach an overall population figure. In other words, these figures are dependent on both the dubious accuracy of the reports submitted by hundreds of parish clerks and the use of a multiplier that's derived from a long and complex narrative of how population statistics should work. Let's see what it is. In other words, these are also problematic. On the other hand, the beauty of the population statistics derived from the bills of mortality is that it gives you both an annual rate of change and a population figure for each of the 173 odd parishes included in this data set. All of which suggests that, if you bring it all together, that both the population of London and the number of trials at the Old Bailey increased significantly over the course of the 18th century. This graph shows the overall per capita prosecutions increasing by a third, from just over 900 prosecutions per 100,000 in the 1720s to just under 1,200 in the 1810s. But this increase was not linear. Per capita prosecutions declined between the 1720s and the 1760s, before rising significantly in the 1770s and 80s, the rate then declining substantially in the 1790s, before rising again to its highest level in the 1810s. Now, I'm afraid I like this graph. But by using population figures from the bills of mortality, we can get a much more granular look at exactly the same data. This graph illustrates yearly changes in prosecution, moderated against population, and against changes also in real wages, or rather real wages are really mapped on top of, rather than moderated within the data, with the dates of Britain's many 18th and early 19th century wars picked out. And while there is no consistent correlation between real wages and the year-by-year fluctuations in prosecutions, The long-term rise in prosecutions does mirror the declining fortune of London's, of working Londoners. In contrast, and reinforcing the conclusion of a substantial secondary literature, military mobilization and demobilization does appear to have a significant short-term impact on those same prosecution rates. The wars of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American War and French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars, all coincide with periods of relatively low prosecutions. And this pattern is even more pronounced when you remove female defendants from the figures. Ironically, the early work coming to the conclusion didn't bother to make a differentiation by gender on the defendants, even though obviously mobilization and demobilization was highly gendered in its effect. So independent of these long-term and short-term effects, our statistics also suggest that the prosecution rates were gradually falling in the first half of the century, first half of our period, and then rose substantially in the second half. For 43 years after 1720, a period when London's population was largely stagnant, there was an overall decline in prosecutions. While in contrast, the next 56 years saw a general and significant increase, even when moderated against a strongly growing population. And this is very much what the population of London was doing. It was largely stagnant from the 1650 to 1750, and then really took off. So while wars and immiseration form important parts of this story, the transitions exposed in the data is not necessarily or easily explained by either. So the question that Bob and I asked ourselves is, what can geography add? This slide shows locations assigned to crimes from 1720 to 1763. And the map suggests a distinctive concentration of prosecutions in the West End, and a particular concentration in the more easterly parishes of the West End of St. Giles in the Field, Covent Garden, and St. Andrew Holborn. In contrast, prosecutions were significantly lower in the city and in the parishes north and east of the city. In the second half of our period, patterns of prosecution changed. Not only did per capita rates increase, but the geographical distribution of prosecution widened. Prosecutions were more evenly distributed across both the east and west ends, with an increasing number of prosecutions in the parishes north of the city. So what I want to do next is test this pattern of prosecutions against developments in the night watch, in the rise of the city rotation offices, the rise of the Bow Street runners, and the Middlesex rotation offices, and finally the Thames Police, to test the extent to which institutional change explains these patterns and this chronology. So, despite the fact that the first half of the century witnessed a relative decline in prosecutions, the poor reputation of watchmen and increasing concern about levels of crime, however spurious, led to calls for reform. And from the 1730s, watch acts were passed regularizing the collection of the watch rate, enabling the watch to be paid, and to substantially increase the number of watchmen employed. Householders serving by rotation were replaced by salaried employees. It essentially regularized that whole process of surveillance. And the first acts were passed in Westminster, where 7 of the 9 parishes had watch acts passed between 1735 and 1736. And the following year, the City of London had a general watch act of its own passed, increasing the number of watchmen employed in the city from 550 to 672. So there is a fundamental transition in the nature of how policing was taking place. There was a fundamental transition in the amount of money being applied. There was a substantial transition in just the number of men on the streets. And you'd expect that to have an impact on prosecutions. This graph reflects crime location grouped by parish in the 7 Westminster parishes affected. If a newly effective night watch resulted in more crime being prosecuted, this figure should rise after 1736, but with 2 exceptions. The prosecution rate actually declined slightly. On average, the prosecution rate for these Westminster parishes remained at around 1 prosecution per 1,000 people per year, right through 1750, and then rose only gradually through the following decade and a half. In the city, the watch was organized by ward, and as with Westminster, an analysis of the overall prosecution rate for the 25 city wards, moderated in this instance by the number of households, tells a similar story. While 2 wards, Cornhill and Cheap, saw significant increases in prosecutions in the latter half of the 1730s, there was, again, no sustained change. A very modest trend line of increasing prosecution starting in the 1720s and the 1730s slowed in the decades after the act. Of course, part of this is that the night watch wasn't designed to go out and proactively find felons and drag them to the Old Bailey. They were overwhelmingly concerned with social disorder rather than the felonies tried in the central, what would become the Central Criminal Court. Prostitutes, vagrants, and beggars, the drunk and the disorderly, members of this seminar, form the main object of its attention. And once taken up, few would have ended up at the Old Bailey. Most were held in the watch house overnight before being brought before a local justice. And the only crime where an arrest by a watchman was likely to result in a trial at the Old Bailey was theft. And this constituted a small part of the watch's business. For the city, we can also test for the impact of the number of watchmen deployed by dividing city wards between those with the highest number of watchmen per household from those with the lowest number. Following 1737, the 7 best served wards, typically the smaller inner city wards, had a watchman for every 16 or 17 houses. Basically, there was a watchman on every block. While the 7 least, surveyed ones had a watchman for every 300 to 400 houses. Just a massive difference. Sorry, 1 watchman for every 45 houses. And the level of prosecution in these wards was actually negatively correlated with the number of households per watchman. Wards such as Walbrook, which employed 18 men to watch 293 houses, a watchman for every 16 houses, saw an average of 2.6 prosecutions per 5-year period between 1721 and 1765. In contrast, Cripplegate, which had 54 watchmen to watch over 2,694 households, a watchman for every 50 houses, saw an average of over 20 prosecutions every year. In other words, there's a negative correlation between the number of watchmen. The fewer watchmen you have, the more prosecutions you have, essentially. And you can express this as a correlation coefficient. This slide illustrates that coefficient for all 25 wards for the period from 1737 to 1765, suggesting a relatively weak pattern, but one strongly affected by just a few outliers: Farringdon without, Queen, Hyde, and Cheap. In other words, the most intensively policed wards saw the fewest prosecutions. Of course, the character of the inner intensively policed city wards and their associated parishes was very different to that of the large extramural wards that had those few watchmen. But it's also possible that we're simply asking the wrong question. The night watch was intended to preserve good order and prevent crime by ensuring that the streets were quiet and householders left undisturbed, except by the night watchman endlessly calling the hour. The lack of prosecutions should perhaps be taken as a measure of success. A dense network of effective watchmen patrolling the streets would have been a significant deterrent to anyone intent on serious crime. So improvements in the watch may have contributed to the decline in per capita prosecutions between 1720 and 1763. Now, in parallel to those developments of the watch, you also had the development of new forms of access to magistrates, or magistrates' offices, or what we call rotation offices. And these were almost precisely the same period. Traditionally, when a crime occurred, victims and witnesses were expected to report the fact to a local magistrate, but finding one, even in a city with hundreds of them, could be difficult. So the advent of rotation offices, where one or more justices would sit regularly at an appointed place for an appointed period, substantially enhanced accessibility to justice. And the first offices were established in the city, where aldermen served as magistrates. And following the death of Sir Richard Brookas in November of 1737, it was decided to divide the work he'd undertaken among his fellow aldermen by instituting a regular sitting at the Guildhall, creating London's first proper magistrates' court. Monday to Friday, from 11 to 2 p.m., an alderman sitting as a magistrate was on duty. An overlapping service was also provided by the Lord Mayor at the Mansion House from 1752. And in Westminster, Thomas de Ville established his own magistrate's office in a similar vein at his house in Bow Street in 1740, following the award of a government sinecure. So, in contrast to the essentially negative finding that improvement in the night watch had no direct impact, there is some evidence that access to the city rotation offices had a positive impact on prosecution. A comparison of the wards closest to the Guildhall and Mansion House with the larger wards along the city's border suggests easy access to the rotation offices of the Guildhall, and from 1752, the Mansion House is associated with more prosecutions per household. The prosecution rate for inner London wards directly adjacent to the Guildhall, including Bassishaw, Cheap, Walbrook, and Cordwainers, rose almost 2.5 times between the 1730s and the early 1740s, from an admittedly very low base, following the creation of the Guildhall Magistrates Court, and rose again in the 1750s, following the creation of the Lord Mayor's Justice Room and at the Mansion House. Overall, between the early 1730s and the late 1750s, prosecutions originating in these inner city wards rose almost threefold. In other words, while intensive policing by the watch in the smaller inner wards did not drive up prosecution, proximity to the Guildhall and Mansion House and their easy access to a magistrate did. We can also see the importance of this proximity in individual cases. In the case of somebody like Elizabeth West and Anne Armstrong in May of 1740, after a long morning drinking at the Sign of the Bell and Grenadier and Grub Street, just north of the Guildhall, they stole a silver tankard. On being taken up by William Foster, the innkeeper, Elizabeth was marched that few hundred yards south to the Guildhall, where Sir John Thompson promptly committed her to Newgate and an eventual trial at the Old Bailey. Meanwhile, Anne Armstrong, who she'd been drinking with all that morning, was arrested trying to sell the tankard at a local goldsmith's, who, after notifying a constable, again marched the suspect off to the Guildhall, where he encountered Foster, with the sitting alderman being gone, and was carried then before the Lord Mayor who committed her. In other words, that ease of prosecution, that ease of capture and commitment appears to have had a substantive impact. Now, Thomas de Ville, the first stipendiary magistrate, died in 1746. And shortly after his death, Henry Fielding took over the office and began sitting regularly, creating, if you like, another rotations office. He was later joined by his half-brother John, and following Henry's death in 1754 in Lisbon, by Saunders Welsh, effectively creating, again, a small rotations office. The important aspect of this development, though, was that in addition to creating another regularly accessible magistrate's office, the Fieldings formalized and expanded a new type of policing. The Bow Street Runners, building on the disgraced thief takers. Fielding essentially established a body of men under his supervision who were paid a retainer to supplement any rewards they received and to effectively go out and find crime. Focusing on the detection of criminals, the runners could be sent out to almost to any part of London, but they concentrated on the West End in the first instance. Unlike the watch, the runners' main purpose was to apprehend felons, who would then normally be prosecuted at the Old Bailey, where rewards could be allocated. They're seen as the starting point in the development of a professional police. And in contrast to either the City Magistrates Court at the Guildhall and Mansion House or Fielding's predecessor, Thomas DeVille, these employed officers, they were employed as officers at Bow Street, unlike those other rotation officers. Now, the runners' chief concern was, in fact, felony. And John Beattie's extensive research established that they made a major impact on Old Bailey business. But the geographical distribution of their activities has never been actually explored. To do this requires identifying who the runners were, which is difficult since Henry Fielding initially did not want to publicize their names. We also don't know how many runners there actually were at any given time, but we can trace the names we know. This map provides the locations of the crimes involving runners who were active in the period from 1751 to 1763, and from 1764 to 1780, in red and blue, respectively. The period of their most intense activity in London, and it shows that the runners initially worked mostly around Bow Street and the West End, but that in the next 15-year period, expanded their area of activity to include most of the metropolis north of the Thames. John Beattie calculated that between 1766 and 1773, the runners were involved in almost half of all commitments for trial at the Old Bailey. But what his evidence suggests is that their impact, what this evidence suggests is that in that latter period in particular, their impact was citywide. After John Fielding's death in 1780, the runners started to become more active outside London, and as I'll discuss in a minute, rotation offices established in other parts of the metropolis came to take on similar work, muting the overall impact of Bow Street. But equally important, the geographical distribution of their activities didn't simply reflect the distribution of Old Bailey cases. It's not just that they were everywhere, even in the 1770s. This map shows all Old Bailey prosecutions in blue and the activities of the runners in red. Areas in purple reflect concentrations of both prosecutions overall and those initiated by the runners. The pattern of purple on this map suggests that the activities of the runners help push up prosecutions in specific parts of London. So, eventually, the East End also came to benefit from the activities of runners based in different rotation offices. From 1763, the Middlesex Justices set up 6 additional rotation offices to supplement the work of the Bow Street runners. In addition to 3 in the West End, there were now offices in Clerkenwell, to the north of the city, and Shoreditch, Whitechapel, and Shadwell to the east. Like Bow Street, these were staffed by rotating justices, and each had a number of constables or runners assigned to them. Additionally, in 1792, the Middlesex Justices Act put these offices, now variously termed police or public offices, on a more established footing by creating 7 additional offices and appointing 3 stipendiary justices and 6 constables to staff each of them. In other words, the sheer volume of both paid justices and proactive policing was going up significantly in steps from Bow Street through 1763 through 1792. By 1816, there were at least 7 constables per office, each paid a retainer, as well as receiving rewards, fees, and penalties. Additionally, each office employed 2 or 3 clerks and a messenger. Some also had a jailer, an office keeper, and a housekeeper. The potential of these offices to affect levels of prosecution was substantial, and our evidence suggests that that potential was actually achieved. Let's see. And this one, yes, I did. Yeah. This map shows the wide distribution of public offices across London, mapped against prosecution rates for the 27 years following the 1792 Act, ignoring Southwark as outside the jurisdiction of the Old Bailey. Almost all of the public offices are in or near areas with a high prosecution rate. As with Bow Street, these offices appear to have altered the geographic distribution of prosecutions in London. The final bit of this puzzle that I want to test is the establishment of the Thames Police or Marine Police offices from 1798. This was based in Wapping and was initially jointly funded by the West India Committee, representing slavers and merchants in sugar and tobacco. Is one of the great ironies that I'm waiting for somebody to do the work on, that the origins of arguably one of the origins of the Metropolitan Police can be found in the slave trade and the desire to protect and prosecute any depredations on it. That hasn't actually seemed to occur to people working either on the history of the police or indeed on enslavement. The office in Wapping was set up with the intention to prevent thefts from the docks and ships in the Thames. And it was given statutory footing by the Home Office with Home Office funding in 1800 and renamed the Thames Police. This occurred at just that moment in London history when the docks were being enclosed, when that massive infrastructure project of St. Catherine's Dock, the West India Dock, and all the others were being put in place. Factories with walls outside in an attempt to stop the theft of goods from the port. But the office in Wapping is perhaps a good measure of just how much money and effort was being put in. It had a head surveyor or chief constable for the river, 17 other river officers, 56 river constables, 1 head constable for the land, 6 land constables, and 2 messengers and a watchman who also acted as constables. In addition, there were 37 land constables employed by the dock companies, but answerable to the Thames Police. And as an extraordinary wartime measure during the Napoleonic Wars, 17 additional constables were also employed. At its peak, the office had as many as 140 different constables all out looking for crime. As a result, the dockside parishes became the most heavily policed part of London, which is ironic because those same dockside parishes were being eviscerated. They were being dug up. Whole communities were being shifted. The population of Wapping dropped by something like half between 1800 and 1820, simply because all the land that people had traditionally lived on, all those communities were being dug and used for other purposes. When they received reports of crime, the land constables participated in the detection and arrest of offenders, while the river surveyors apprehended persons that had stolen property with it in their possession. At the direction of the Home Office, they were also deployed to other parts of the metropolis in response to public disorder. In other words, this was effectively a single coordinated police that could respond to Home Office demands as well as local magistrate demands, as well as, of course, the demands of all those slave traders and everybody else. The active prosecutorial character of the Thames Police is reflected in the direct employment by them of solicitors and merchants, as solicitors by the West Indian Merchants Company. Their barrister, Jerome William Knapp, was involved as prosecuting counsel in at least 32 Old Bailey trials involving Marine or Thames Police between 1798 and 1813. An 1821 report to the Home Office records the Thames Police averaging 13 felony prosecutions per month, in addition to 40 misdemeanor prosecutions per month. And the terms Thames Police or Marine Police appears 224 times between 1798 and 1819 in the Old Bailey proceedings. And the range of offenses prosecuted reflects both the police force's stated purpose to combat theft from ships or the docks and their wider impact on London as a whole. Of the 224 offenses prosecuted, 130 were for grand larceny, 36 were for theft from a specified place, such as a ship or a dwelling house, and 20 were for receiving stolen goods. A comparison of theft prosecution rates in the East End parishes nearest the Thames for the 20 years before the Marine Police were set up with the 20 years afterwards shows that prosecution rates almost doubled, with the greatest increases occurring in the waterside parishes of Wapping, Shadwell, and Radcliffe, despite declining populations. In comparison, prosecutions in parishes with a more limited riverside presence, Aldgate and St. George in the east, rose much more slowly. And the theft prosecution rate for the metropolis as a whole, north of the Thames, increased by a relatively modest 61%. The establishment of the Thames Police marked and almost certainly directly contributed to these increases. And while the creation of enclosed London docks from 1805 made stealing from ships and the dockside more difficult, a growing determination to prosecute thieves, combined with their increased visibility and intensive proactive policing, simply led to more prosecutions. What Bob and I have been trying to do with this work is to demonstrate, first of all, that there was 100 years of criminal justice reform and it brought dramatic change. In the 1730s, the solution to anxiety about crime was the creation of a more professional night watch and the invention of early rotation offices in the city. The evidence presented here suggests that the Watch Acts led to a small decrease in prosecutions of the Old Bailey, while the early rotation offices led to, at best, modest increases in prosecutions from their immediate vicinity. In the nature of a preventative form of policing, the Night Watch sought to maintain good order at the expense of generating arrests and prosecutions. In contrast, after 1750, and particularly after 1763, the runners associated with both Bow Street and the Middlesex rotation offices, the police or public offices from 1792, and most significantly, the Thames Police from 1798, with their teams of runners and constables, led ineluctably to higher levels of felony prosecution. The officers of London's newly proactive magistrates' offices set out to find criminals and to prosecute them at the Old Bailey, and they succeeded. In our estimation, they both increased the overall rates of prosecution and almost more significantly, drove types of crime that might have been dealt with informally by magistrates into the higher courts, into the felony courts, and into a system where the outcome was both more likely to be punitive and more likely to be serious, whether that was hanging or transportation. The limitations of the evidence, together with the complexity of the patterns mapped today, mean that we can't push that argument too far. Patterns of prosecution were shaped by different forces, including poverty and war. Nevertheless, the evidence presented here, we think, suggests that the rise of a professional-ish police in the late 18th and early 19th centuries led to a shift in the geographical range of crimes prosecuted at the Old Bailey. Whereas prosecutions in the early 18th century were most likely to come from the West End, in the second half of our period, proactive policing drove up prosecution across the metropolis outside of the city. By the early 19th century, magistrates and officers were now available across the metropolis to make arrests and facilitate prosecutions. And this is not to argue that the prevalence or distribution of crime changed. I don't believe it did in any way, nor that crimes were now being formally prosecuted particularly, but to suggest instead that the institutional mechanisms in place meant that more crimes were being pursued to a felony trial at the Old Bailey. They were essentially shifting the social response to disorder from the informal mechanisms of the early 18th century to much more formal ones. More broadly, this transformation reflects the relative decline of London as a collection of self-policing communities, for which the preservation of good order was paramount. The reliance on the watch for preventative policing was disrupted by the creation of new forms of proactive policing that was designed to search out deviant and criminal behavior wherever it was found, and ensure that the system of felony prosecution would be used to convict those caught up in the process. In many ways, this transition mirrors the broader social attitudes to criminals identified by historians like Andrea Mackenzie. The everyman figure Mackenzie finds reflected in early 18th century accounts of executed criminals, someone descending into crime via sin, was imagined as a member of a community. They were simply normal people fallen off the path of righteousness. In contrast, the criminal deviance and adherence of a crime-prone subculture that increasingly filled the dark imaginings of later 18th and early 19th century Londoners stood outside the community, and their misbehavior required formal prosecution and punishment by forces that could work above and beyond the parish and ward boundaries. The effect was both to ensure that a wider swath of London's population would be caught up in the criminal justice system, and that the Old Bailey itself would be tested to breaking point by ever-growing caseload. Arguably, what was created was a pool of men whose self-interest lay in identifying forms of behavior that could be prosecuted and ensuring that it was prosecuted in the one court able to allocate substantial rewards. In 1763, there were some 519 defendants standing trial at the Old Bailey. In 1819, that figure had more than tripled to 2,041. Moderated for population, prosecutions almost doubled from 0.74 defendants per 1,000 of the population to 1.42. And this pressure of business would continue to grow through the mid-century and led to a second, third, and fourth courtroom being opened in 1824, 1847, and 1856, respectively. The creation, arguably, of a new bureaucratic state apparatus had spirited into existence a whole series of crimes that would in turn justify the ongoing expansion of that same state's judicial arm. What you have, in our estimation, is both the creation, the identification, of crime that then justified the creation of a ever more expensive criminal justice system. Thank you.